Hi, everyone. Welcome to our discussion on this topic, which is agriculture, which is Ind AS 41. Friends, this topic was never there under the AS framework. So this is, of course, a relatively new topic. It has, of course, a very limited practical application because when you look at organizations at large, talk about service industries or pharmaceuticals or manufacturing or IT or banking, you don't really see an agricultural activity taking place. So in that context, this particular standard would be of limited use, right? But then, from an examination standpoint, you can expect anything from the ICAI, and this topic could be as relevant as some other topic, right? So I think we need to appreciate that there is a standard, even more because we are an agricultural economy. So I think we want to really spend some time talking about this standard in terms of what is the scoping of this particular standard, how it should be looked upon, and of course understanding the accounting consequences of that. Okay, so what we want to do is, before we formally get into the technical discussions, looking at the definitions, objective scope, etc., let's try to understand how does it work on in the agricultural space. Okay, and how does this particular standard look at what is that which is within the scope of the standard and what is probably outside the scope of the standard. Okay, so imagine you are doing some agricultural activity. It could be, for example, let's say managing a poultry farm or tea plantation, or it could be fisheries or something like that, right? So there could be multitude of such activities wherein you either have some animals. When you refer to that, you are probably talking about the cattle, or the herd of sheep, for example, right? Or it could be, let's say, plants, for example, as I mentioned about the tea plantations, for the sake of argument, or maybe an estate wherein you are growing apples, let's say in the valley. It could be similar activities about producing sugar cane, or it could be any such agricultural produce for that matter, right? So when you look at it, what we want to talk about here is that the scoping of this standard is very, very specific. Okay, so it would include, for example, if I were to consider that, let's say I'm managing a herd of sheep, right? As a farmer, for example, I'm managing a herd of sheep, and or a herd of sheep, sorry. So when I say I'm looking at the sheep, I would include this so-called as biological asset, right? So any such animal, any such you know animal, or a living organism in that space would be a part of my agricultural produce, right? Would be a part of my standard, on for recognition accounting purposes, right? Recognition measurement purposes when I say accounting, right? But then if I look at the sheep, I might also be, let's say, extracting wool from that sheep. Okay, now the standard says that output this output is referred to as agriculture produce, and even this is included within the scope of this standard, which is Ind AS 41. Okay, but now when I move a little farther, if I say that I'm going to use this wool to probably make some woolen clothes, or I'm going to process it further and let's say produce some yarn, right? And stuff like that. Now the moment this processing comes, this so-called as a natural transformation, this agriculture produce, which is a natural outcome of that, let's say, biological asset like sheep, So that agricultural activities stop there. Okay. So here, Ind AS 41 would not be applicable. Probably a standard like Ind AS 2 would start to apply. Okay. Right. Similarly, if I say this sheep is giving birth to, the next generation, right? So even that biological transformation, right? Even that biological transformation would still be a part of Ind AS 41. Okay. And again, you talk about the wool being generated from this next generation's, sheep. So that would continue to stay in Ind AS 41. But any further processing of that wool, for example, would be excluded from this particular standard. So it's all about knowing what is all covered within the standard and what is probably outside the scope of the standard. Okay. Likewise, if I say I were to use, I was using an example of the poultry farm. So let's say we are, let's say, uh, taking care of chicken or hen and all that, the entire breed of, the biological asset, right? So all these animals, all these, let's say, living organisms, they would again fall a part of Ind AS 41. Okay. And then the natural produce out of that, for example, there could be, let's say, an egg, for example, right? Even that egg, which becomes a part of agriculture produce, is a part of, again, Ind AS 41. But then if I'm using this egg, let's say, to make omelets, for example, right? Automatically that natural transition or natural transformation has stopped, taking place. And this output, which is being created by a further processing, would be excluded from Ind AS 41 or the scope of Ind AS 41. And probably in this case, again, you look at Ind AS 2, right? Or even if I look at this chicken, where I talk about a processed meat, for example, that would again be outside the scope of Ind AS 41. Okay. Likewise, we go a bit further and we say that, we are doing some agriculture activity, right? So, for example, we refer to the tea plantations. Okay. So in case of a tea plantation, okay, in case of a tea plantation, I know that I would need, for example, an entire land. Okay. And then, of course, I would be growing those leaves, etc. Right? I would growing the plantation for that matter. And of course, I will have my leaves as a produce, as a natural produce out of that. Okay. Now, interestingly and importantly, land is not considered under Ind AS 41. Land is not considered under Ind AS 41. For that matter, if I say I have got a license to operate the tea plantation, which could be done like that, even that license is not covered under Ind AS 41. So for land, for example, it could be either Ind AS 16 property, plant and equipment, or it could be a right of use asset under Ind AS 116, which is leases. If you look at a license, automatically Ind AS 38, which is, intangible assets, that start coming in the picture. So the accounting is driven by that. But the moment you talk about the leaves, these are the natural produce, and Ind AS 41 would be applicable. Right? Now, importantly, and you would be able to kind of get that answer as well. If I say I'm processing those leaves, right? If I'm processing those leaves and trying to make some, alternative produce like a tea, tea bag, or let's say, the tea as in the particles for that matter. Now they would again not be covered under Ind AS 41, but probably they would get into Ind AS 2's framework. Okay. So this distinction is important because we need to first of all agree what is covered within the scope of this standard and what is excluded from the scope of the standard. Okay. Why it is so? Because this particular standard has a specific measurement need. The specific measurement requirement is that on day one and subsequently, all agricultural produce or biological assets, they need to be measured at fair value less cost to sell. All biological assets and all agricultural produce, which is of course a part of the scope of the standard, on any day, on day one as well as on the reporting date, on the subsequent measurement, they all need to be reported at fair value less cost to sell, and these need to be reported through P&L. These need to be reported through profit or loss. Okay, so something that you always want to remember as a part of this particular standard. Okay, which means what? Till the time it's a leaf or a leaf under a tree plantation, or let's say an egg, or maybe you talk about wool, you follow this particular accounting treatment. But the moment it passes on to the Ind AS 2 framework, okay, then of course we have a clear criteria of cost or NRV, whichever is lower. Okay, so you start bringing those aspects in accounting, and that's what you want to remember at all times. Okay, and that's the reason I said that it's very, very critical for you to understand. It's very, very important for you to understand what is covered within the scope of the standard and what is excluded from that. Okay, and it is a huge P&L consequence. The significance of what is covered within the scope of the standard, it's the entire measurement, entire change in the value is impacted through the statement of profit or loss. And that's the reason why it is a critical standard on accounting perspective. Somebody who's managing an agricultural activity, who's conducting an agricultural activity, managing some biological assets or agricultural produce, they would realize that. And they would, of course, understand that the entire consequence lies on the statement of profit or loss. So there's a huge volatility that can come. You can have a very high value in 1 year and very significantly low value in the second year also, right? So it all depends on what is the value or what is the fair value of that particular agricultural produce, or let's say the biological asset for that matter. Okay, so that is why this standard becomes a little more critical for us to understand. Okay, so what exactly should we expect? What should we know about this particular standard? We are talking about several aspects. Briefly knowing the meanings of, for example, what is an agricultural activity, what is meant by an agricultural produce, what is a bearer plant, it is a significance. You would recollect we had talked about this under the Ind AS 16 context, right? So we want to discuss this definition in more detail. What is meant by biological transformation, and what, for example, is the meaning of a biological asset also. The principles of recognition and measurement, we have talked about that as well. And this is something which is always you want to carry fair value less cost to sell and impact through statement of profit or loss. Always carry this the moment you hear agriculture. Okay. And by the way, interestingly, importantly, there is a specific aspect of grants relating to, for example, agricultural activities or a biological asset specifically, right? It is not something which is driven by Ind AS 20, which is a separate accounting standard for accounting for government grants. Okay. So there is a separate grant or a treatment of grant done as far as the agricultural activities or a biological asset within that is concerned. Okay. So Let's talk about briefly also the examination pattern. Not really tested very frequently, but of course, the ICAI can always surprise us, right? And of course, in November 19, they give us short question, but at the same time, of course, the coverage was there. Of course, this topic is not huge. So if at all you know this topic well, and any question comes, it's a bonus question straight away, because nothing much is, is complicated as far as this particular topic is concerned. So you should be very comfortable knowing the reference of this particular standard. Okay. So let's talk about the idea or the objective and scope of the standard. We say that the standard itself sets out the accounting for the agricultural activity, the management of transformation of biological assets, which would include living plants and animals, into agricultural produce. Now, the key is this is the harvested product of the entity's biological assets. Don't think too technical about these terminologies. There is a broader definition given for all these terminologies as well. So let's try to understand those as well. Important key point: your agricultural produce or biological assets are measured at all times at fair value less cost to sell. Okay. Of course, this is a new standard. There was no clarity. We have, of course, in the global framework, which is IFRS, there is a corresponding standard, which is IAS 41. So basis that, much of it is picked up from that standard itself. Okay. So when you look at the scoping part of it, applies to all relevant parts. For example, biological assets. There are several examples. We have used those references somewhere in terms of cattle, wines. When you say wines, we're talking about the grape wine, for example, trees, sheep, etc. Agricultural produce at the point of harvest. Now, harvest is basically, for example, when you pluck the leaves of the tea plant, right? So those tea leaves become your agriculture produce at the point of harvest, right? So they're all included as a part of this standard. And of course, as we said, government grants for these agricultural activities or biological assets within the standard would be applicable there. Okay. Now it is something which we want to talk about, that produce the leaves or the wool or the milk or the eggs that we talked about. Now, importantly, the standard is also applicable to the agricultural produce, which is the harvested product of the entity's biological asset only at that point in time. Okay. And a later point in time, very likely inventories would start becoming applicable. Most likely inventories would start becoming applicable. So we need to be carefully assessing the timing of that. Okay. Now, essentially, the land, as we discussed, would not be covered here. It is covered through property, plant, and equipment, likely. Intangible assets would be covered through, the licenses, for example, would be covered through Ind AS 38. Any government grants relating to bearer plants would be specifically covered through Ind AS 20. And then the bearer plants as well, which is a part of course, Ind AS 16. They are, again, not covered here. And as we said also before, if there is a land on which you are conducting agricultural activity, but the land is taken on lease, even that land would not be covered by this standard. It was likely falling under the scoping of Ind AS 116. All right.